intrigued by the stories about women in Sufism, like Sufism. And please correct my Rabia.
Rabia, yes.
Rabia. And I just wonder if you could speak a little bit about that of women.
I'm glad you brought that up. Actually, because Rabia actually she's one of the earliest Sufis. She lives in the 8th century. And she's one of the most well-known Sufis. Right? She's she's become, to some extent in the literature, the Sufi everywoman, right? She is, any story that's attributed to some Sufi women often will sometimes get attributed to her. But Rabia is very important, not just because she's a woman, and she's one of those who chose to be celibate, but because she's really the person who formulates the Sufi conception of love of God. Rabia said there's a lot of different things that are attributed to Rabia that really bring out her conception of what love of God actually means. So, for example, and I'll tell you some of those, maybe you can get a sense of what it is. For example, someone came to her and asked for her hand in marriage. And she said, I don't belong to myself. Right? I belong to him. You've got to ask my hand in marriage, from him. Right? Loving God is complete submission of one's ego to God's will, right? Being completely servant of God. But she also said things like, "Oh Lord," she would pray, "give all of the things I have in this world to my enemies. And give all of the things you've stored up for me in the next world to my friends. But all I want is you." Right? And she said, "I just want you." Right? And again, this is the idea when I was saying that the difference between ihsan and doing certain other kinds of acts that are recommended or required in Islam is the intention for which you are doing it. Right? And she was doing it purely to be lovable in the eyes of God, purely to have God's presence. And she would say about making the Hajj, for example. She said, "Everybody goes to see the house, but I go to see the Lord of the house. And I didn't find him," right? I can't see him there. And there's an interesting story that's told. She decided to go and make Hajj one year, Rabia. And at the same time, starting a while before, was another pious man who himself was a Sufi. And he wanted to make Hajj. And he decided that to be extra pious, he was going to make the trip from Baghdad in Iraq all the way to Mecca. And it wasn't enough that he was going to do it on foot when he was wealthy enough to go by camel or horse or caravan or anything else. That wasn't enough. He was going to take 2 steps, and for every 2 steps, he said, he would say 2 cycles of prayer. And then he would take another 2 steps and 2 cycles of prayer. And he would do this all the way walking from Baghdad to Mecca. Turns out it took him 14 years. Right? It's a long way from Baghdad to Mecca. So anyway, he finally arrives after 14 long years and I'm sure a lot of blisters. He finally arrives at Mecca at the same time when Rabia is arriving at Mecca. But just before Rabia arrives at Mecca, she begins her menstrual cycle and she can't actually go in. Right? So she has to stay outside. And she says, "Oh God, I came all this way. Why would you do this to me?" And the story, and it is, of course, a symbolic story, but the story says that the Kaaba lifted up and came to her. Now, that was great for her, but this poor man has been walking from Baghdad to Mecca the whole way. He finally gets there, and there's no Kaaba there. And he finds out what happened. Someone tells him what happened. He goes to see Rabia, and he says to her, "How could you do this to me, you silly woman?" And she says, "Silly woman, you, look at making a show of yourself like that all the way down, attracting attention to yourself. Everybody, oh, look at this man, the whole way down. You did nothing but create a circus." Right? So again, it's this idea of intention, right? This idea of doing it for the purpose of being there with God and not for anything else. Right? And another famous final one I'll close with that really sort of gets at this idea of ultimately what you're supposed to be, how you're supposed to be living and why, It's told, again, almost certainly not a entirely true story, but it's said that Rabia, who lived in Basra, in Iraq, would run through the streets of Basra. She had a reputation for being a little, appearing a little crazy, at least to some people outwardly, that she would run through Basra carrying a torch in one hand and a bucket of water in the other. And she would do this, she said she would do this so that she could burn up the gardens of paradise and use the water to douse the fires of hell so that people would love and worship God for God rather than for any kind of reward that they would have in the next life, right? And that comes down to this idea of, and it's interesting, and of course it's complex because the Quran certainly talks about the rewards you're going to have in paradise and threatens about the punishments that you're going to have in hell all the time. Right? If you read the Quran, it's quite clear that there's really nothing wrong with a person doing good things because they want to achieve paradise. The Quran puts that forward as a major motivator. Right? And there's nothing wrong with avoiding bad actions because you want to avoid hell. If there was, the Quran wouldn't talk about it so much. But for someone who is following whether you want to call it Sufism or you want to call it the path of Ihsan, whatever it might be, whatever label you want to give it, the idea is that ultimately the goal is a selfless performance of these actions.